most senior leaders confuse organizational friction with work friction. But the two are very different in that organizational friction is essentially friction created by processes that could be made more efficient, digital transformation and process mining and so on and so forth. Work friction actually is seen from the perspective of a worker who sits in the middle of that organization and who is trying to do stuff. And so you end up with, so you could end up in a company with lots of very optimized processes, but with very high work friction because they don't work together. And when people are under the gun of the real life of an employee trying to solve problems and trying to do their job, it just doesn't work.
Christophe Martel is the co-founder and CEO of Fount, a platform that helps companies identify and remove workplace friction. He has 30 years of experience helping organizations improve the way their people work. He was formerly the Chief Human Resources Officer at talent management and employee experience consulting firm CEB, which sold to Gartner for $2.7 billion in 2017. Fount's clients are some of the world's leading organizations, including Adidas, BMW, Allianz, PepsiCo, T-Mobile, IKEA, United Health Group, Ralph Lauren, and Siemens. Christophe, welcome to Voices of HR.
Good morning, and thanks for having me here.
Well, we are so excited for this conversation. And as I was just listing some of your clients, that's quite a roster.
Yeah, that's lots of great companies that all are trying to face the misery of work friction since it spares no one, and the larger you are, and the more it tends to occur.
That is so true. And I'm so glad that we're talking to you today because it is something that every organization, it impedes their productivity and their engagement and so many of their key performance indicators. So we're going to help our audience today figure it all out, figure out what this workplace friction looks like and how they can identify it. And then I think you're also going to lend your expertise in how we can resolve it. So let's start here. Because I can certainly attest to the fact, having written a book about workplace friction, and there are many, many books out there as well, that this isn't just unique to large organizations, which I think is what most people would think, or even smaller to medium size. Mm-hmm. Gartner actually conducted a study on workplace friction. Can you tell our audience, let's start here, can you tell them a little bit about the results of that survey?
Sure. So in their research, what they found was that about 2/3 of employees are essentially trying to hack work. And what they mean by that is to work around the inefficiencies, the obstacles that get in their way at work. And when they do, it costs them 2 hours a day of essentially wasted work to try to work around the stuff that should be working and that doesn't. Now, the other third is not hacking through work friction, but just suffers through it. Right. So the wasted work occurs anyway. And from an opportunity cost perspective for organizations, 2 hours of work a day wasted per employee is, both a calamity if you think about it, but also a great opportunity if organizations could recover it.
Absolutely. And I remember in B school, there was, I think it was our management class, that our professor said, in some industries, a 10% decrease in productivity could equate to 100% decrease in profit.
Yeah,
if it was your entire organization. So you're talking about bottom line results that are being affected. with this?
Yeah, it's actually, there's two bottom line impacts and one top line impact. So bottom line impact number one, 2 hours of wasted work. If you were to go and see any CFO and say, I could help you recover 2 hours of wasted work for our employees, they would welcome you with open arms. But on top of that promise, there's actually the tremendous damage that it does to employee engagement. And that means in terms of intent to stay, so that's your attrition rates that kind of plummet, but also discretionary effort, which means, do I really want to lean into this job when the company is making it hard for me to do it? Right, so you have like a compounding effect of wasted work and making people feel so terrible that they either want to quit or take sick days or just take it easy because they don't feel the employee is leaning in enough. So that's two bottom line impacts, and that impacts the P&L directly in year, literally. Now, the top line impact is, well, first of all, that employees on the back foot like that tend to not be that excited about growth, and driving, calling the extra customer, being extra nice to whoever they're supporting on the phone, and you damage customer experience on the back end, right? So whenever you see a situation, for example, in the retail world where, let's say a cashier machines breaks down, a line is forming behind the cashier, and the cashier is standing there not knowing what to do, making them feel terrible. It also impacts customers on the back end. So there is a kind of a hidden tax on growth that companies are paying. And they're paying it mostly because they don't think they can resolve work friction. And that is where we think they can.
Absolutely. So there are some companies that we just talked about where employee friction is definitely a product drain, and no one's really paying attention to it. I mean, I see this in virtually every conversation I have when I'm coaching executives. That's where the conversation typically goes, is to a conflict, a friction. And it's not just interpersonal. It is fundamentally the way that the company is either structured or their processes, or it could be just about anything, industry-wide as well. So it doesn't feel like anybody is really tackling the tough issues. And I think it's because sometimes for executives, it's political, right? They don't want to create even more friction, so they just ignore it. So in your experience, why is this not being addressed? I mean, I gave you some of my thoughts, but are you seeing anything in the data as to why?
So most senior leaders confuse organizational friction with work friction. And it's fair enough because both have friction in it. But the two are very different in that organizational friction is essentially friction created by processes, so processes that could be made more efficient, for example, or any kind of tools that are overly complex and that the organization invests a tremendous amount of money in simplifying. And things of that nature. So executives are very sharp about trying to improve the components of the work environment by investing in digital transformation and process mining and so on and so forth. Work friction actually is different from organizational friction in that it is not friction seen from the perspective of the organization. It is friction seen from the perspective of a worker who sits in the middle of that organization and who is trying to do stuff. And stuff is things that have to do with HR. So using HR services and enterprise services, like, I don't know, changing my benefits or getting paid, or going on parental leave, or finding a new internal role. Like, these are all things that I expect the company to support. And, more often than not, there's a lot of friction when people are just doing that, which is part of their life at work. But then the other side of the friction that they experience is when they're trying to do their work, for example, solve a customer issue. And as they do that, they navigate a bunch of processes and policies and tools that are not in silos, but that are all coming down together on their table. And often were not designed to work together in a holistic way and a ergonomic way for the worker, but were designed for the individual performance of each one of these processes or tools. And so you end up with, so you could end up with, in a company with lots of very optimized processes, but with very high work friction because they don't work together. Mm-hmm. And when people are under the gun of the real life of an employee trying to solve problems and trying to do their job, it just doesn't work. So this confusion is one that leads to a big disconnect between leaders that usually sit on top of the house and are making these massive investments and massive changes and transformations, all well intended. But on the back end, you could actually see many of these investments increasing friction for employees on the front end, right? So the company may have become more efficient because these processes have been streamlined, but at the expense of employees that now have a job that was already hard now become harder. And organizations do this not out of malintent, but simply because of the perspective question. If you're a senior executive, you see a big game board with, big levers that you're pulling. Mm-hmm. If you're at the front line, you see the game board being done to you, right?
Yes.
And sometimes it works, but often it doesn't. So why is it not so much the case in small companies? Because in small companies, leaders are so close to the front lines that they actually live the friction. So in other words, they can see it every day and they know what causes it. And so the friction is there, but because it is visible to people who design processes and tools and policies, then usually it can be addressed and solved by order of priority. In a very large companies, the disconnect is such between leaders and front lines that it's very difficult for leaders to do that.
That makes so much sense, because typically in smaller organizations, there's probably an owner or some sort of equity component too, so that, you're all in this together, right? And if there's a client complaint or whatever, and you probably have the ability to fix it much quicker than in a larger organization. I've also seen larger organizations where they really don't want to tackle either friction or things that are not as seamless in their organization. They would much rather do the strategic work. Mm-hmm. And what I always tell them is you can't execute your strategy flawlessly unless you reduce the friction.
That's right. Yeah. So there is a quality angle to this that one of our customers actually brought to us, which was in the principles of quality, both strategy and execution have to be fed by, of course, the voice of process, but also the voice of the customer. Mm-hmm. And in this case, the voice of the customer is really what employees are saying about not their feelings about the company, but about their work and about mm-hmm. what gets in their way when they do their work, and not say it at a generic level of, oh yeah, it's kind of complicated, but more very specifically about when is friction occurring and what activities is it occurring and what causes it. And once you have that level of insight, then friction can actually be tackled. But otherwise, without that voice of employees that comes in a very structured way to essentially give very quantified ratings on every aspect of their work environment in the context of the things they do, it's almost impossible for senior leaders to know what to wrap their hands around.
Right.
And that's why you always have these very senior leaders, CEOs, doing the rounds, right? So going to spend time with employees and coming back and saying, I don't understand how our engagement scores are, so high, and yet when I travel with, I don't know, a nurse, she spent 3 hours after dinner, putting information into the system after having, done all her visits, right? And it's that doesn't reconcile very well. And so there is a real disconnect between the top and the bottom of the house, and we think that the only way to bridge that disconnect is through data.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit more about how you're leveraging data as an indicator of friction. Can you give us a real world example? I think our audience would love to hear how this all works.
So if we back up just a second and think of what happens for customers. So for us, all of us as humans, when we buy things or use things, and take our phones, for example. So I'm an iPhone user, so I'll just talk about Apple. They have a tremendous amount of data on what I do with my phone constantly, right? And they know what things I use, what things I don't, what seems to work for me and what doesn't. And based on that feedback that is, very rich, they're able to evolve their product to make it ever more frictionless for a user to use. Now, where that parallel stops is that if you think about an employee doing work, their interaction set with their employer is much more complex than me interacting with my phone. Right? It's in all kinds of realms, human, digital, physical, all at once, moving around and doing a zillion activities that are all very complex. And that is where organizations that try to do a very basic port of CX principles, so let's go do journey mapping and let's do that for HR, ended up doing some things a bit better, but really missing the mark when it comes to capturing the real experience of people's work, right? Because let's face it, most employees spend most of their time doing work, not interacting with HR. So where this becomes really interesting is that when you start collecting the right kind of data, you see how HR moments, or HR products and services, how people don't interact with them a lot, but when they do and it fails, it creates a massive damage in terms of not only does it waste their time or in terms of their morale, their experience altogether. So people preparing to go on parental leave and having this much paperwork to fill as they're transitioning their work, it can become super stressful and worrisome about how they're going to be covered when they're gone, and so on and so forth. So the damage that poorly executed HR moments can do is pretty staggering. And at the same time, the other side of the fence, which is the moments of doing my work, so solving a customer problem, or or if I'm customer facing, these moments are very prone to friction because of the complexity of processes and tools that most people are using in their work. And it's essentially a slow burn of my both of my time and my energy Right?
Right.
So I talk about burnout, where everything that should take 5 minutes takes 20 minutes, and it ends up essentially just consuming my time in managing through work friction. So,
So,
this question of like, how do you use data to fix that is
mhm,
actually a question that is shared between HR, which owns all of these HR things that I mentioned
mhm,
earlier, and the business. So business leaders, operations leaders, people that actually define workflows and define the tools that are being used at work and the processes that people use. And so data that is able to cover both of these things at once is how companies approach this.
so all of us are sitting here saying, we totally get this because who doesn't go to their job every single day and there's frustrating components of it because you just can't do anything about it, or at least you feel like you can't.
Mhm.
So, are there ways that data can illuminate common indicators of workplace friction? Or if you don't even have the data, like, are there certain indicators that HR should be looking for?
Yes. So HR is constantly looking at one indicator that is what I would call the echo of work friction, and that is engagement levels.
Mm,
Right. So when you look at any engagement survey, and you see certain populations that are more disengaged, and by the way, that you usually manifest it by high levels of attrition.
mm,
Right, so these are the two indicators where it's a way for people to tell you, "I this is too hard for me,"
mhm,
and so and we did a piece of research recently that showed that 35% employees of employees that experience work friction, when we ask them like, "What? So what?"
mhm,
They will say, "It makes me feel so bad that it makes me want to quit or take days off."
mm,
Right. So that's 1/3 of an employee base, and all of them are experiencing friction. The impact is that. Uh, the rest is more or less saying, "It makes me feel bad, but I don't do anything about it. I just deal with it."
mhm,
So um, the two indicators that you have that work friction is taking place are attrition and engagement levels. There's a third one that's actually performance. When you see people that don't perform as well as they should, uh, there's always this assumption that it's a
mm,
will or a skill issue.
mhm,
But what we found in our data is that often it's these two issues are compounded by a hill issue, which is how much of an incline do these workers have to climb as they do their work? So how much harder the organization is making it for them to perform. Um, so these would be the three lagging indicators. Now the question is, what are the leading indicators of work
mhm,
friction? So how do you get ahead of it? Well, for that, the only thing you can measure is how workers rate their work environment as they do the activities that they try to do. And this is, so in other words, you want to understand when friction occurs in their day to day, because it's not all the time, right? There are certain activities that unfold in, Uh, so, for example, in work we did with call center agents, um, we saw that for some of these folks, learning to do their jobs, getting assistance for understanding customer information, supervisor support, all of these things working great. However, some moments, like for example, handling an abusive caller, which
yeah,
kind of makes sense, is very high friction. or solving a complex customer problem, if they're new hires, becomes a problem because they don't yet know enough to be able to solve it. And the support systems that are supposed to help them do that don't really work. So now these are two moments where people experience a lot of friction. And interestingly, you can also measure how important these moments are for these individuals. So in this example, handling an abusive caller doesn't seem to reflect poorly on the company. So in other words, employees experience it as friction, but they don't blame the company for it. They actually blame the caller. They're like, yeah, it's not your fault if somebody is mad at me. However, when it's difficult to solve a complex customer problem, and you as an organization are supposed to give me the tools to do that, and you don't, then I blame you. And so you essentially have the ability to see amongst all of these activities, some of which include HR activities like changing my shift or taking a break or things like that, or getting paid, and activities that are customer facing. You see a cloud of things that are both really not working for employees and also very important for them. So very high impact on their engagement, intent to stay at the company, and so on and so forth. So what the data essentially starts saying is focus on resolving friction in those moments first. All the other ones are not perfect, maybe, but they're less broken than these. So that's where
whose responsibility is that? So, our audience is HR.
Yep.
And obviously the HR components really feel that's their responsibility. But what about the call centers? What about accounting? Yep. What about all these other departments, particularly in large organizations? Nobody's paying attention.
Well, HR generalists actually are very vested in, so the HR business partners that work in these frontline teams are usually very, very focused on helping their business leaders deal with attrition, right, and deal with disengagement and performance and all the rest of it. So the friction angle is actually an angle that helps them help their business leader, their business partners problem solve with a new toolkit that is no longer about which, what new training are we going to unleash on these people to make them better, but more, what could we remove from their path to help them perform, right? How do we let them perform rather than make them? And so it's actually it's a conversation changer between an HRBP and their business leaders. And it's also a language that business leaders understand. Because they understand friction and they hate wasted work. They're like, oh my God, let's get after that. And it's one of those few things where if you ask employees, would you like us to reduce work friction for you? They would say, yes, please. If you ask a business leader, they would say, yes, please. I don't want to waste 2 hours of work. I would rather get them back. Right?
Well, and you would think today's environment, right? I mean, we still have high inflation. Now we're starting to see a lot more layoffs, right? We're starting to feel the effects of tough economic times.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some organizations out there that don't believe in layoffs. And instead, they really focus on finding these areas of inefficiency.
That's right.
During times like this, in order to keep their workforce, because they know everything's cyclical. Right? Yeah. They know that eventually the markets are going to come back, that inflation's going to go down. And so what I love about what you just said is that for the HR generalists out there, or even our HR pros who are 1 or 2 person shops within an organization, mm-hmm. This is a way for you to be proactive, mm-hmm. be strategic, and speak their language.
That's right. Yes, change the conversation with mm-hmm. business leaders. There's this I spent most of my career as a business leader prior to moving to HR. When HR comes with big words to a business leader, such as leadership, culture, et cetera, it's all useful, interesting, and actually in times of growth, like, sure, let's spend on this, that, and the other. However, when times are tougher, productivity becomes the game.
It does.
And leadership and culture, of course, they're important in the minds of business leaders. But what matters more is that, could you have an impact on my P&L tomorrow? Because if you can, let's go do that.
Yes.
And so for HR, whether it's head of HR in a smaller organization or HR VP in a larger one, it's an ideal conversation changer to say, let's focus on that. You improve retention of your best people, because it turns out, by the way, that high performers hate work friction. Right? Yeah. And we know this across talent segments. When you're good, wasting your time is
painful.
Very painful. So there's a great conversation to be had for them. Now, for central HR in larger organizations, there is the macro conversation of, well, CHRO to CEO, how do we systemically reduce work friction across the organization?
Yes.
Not just with one HR VP, but like across the board.
Right.
And then there's, let's clean our kitchen first, which is, we own a bunch of resources that employees use day in, day out. And so, whether it's benefits or getting paid or and actually, there is countless opportunities to reduce friction in HR products and services. Right? And that's true with basic services, such as those I mentioned, but also higher order ones, like talent things, like career growth within the company. How hard is it really, if I'm an individual and I want to find a new job, apply for it, and then interview and then transfer? And you'll find in most large companies it's actually a very challenging process that where employees feel treated worse than external candidates.
So where are you seeing your clients, some of the biggest name brands in the world? Where are they focusing right now?
Well, it depends on the organization. So the game board is essentially a combination of what I would call all of these HR moments that should be optimized and managed with great precision, right? And that's actually a complex thing to go do. Then the other axis of development is to manage friction within work moments. You actually have to focus on specific roles, right? Because if I'm a call center agent or I'm a software developer, we have very different activities, and the ecosystems we interact with are very different, right? So, it's the sources of friction are going to be very different for both. So, in a very broad-based survey, if you asked, do you have the tools you need to do your job? Probably, or do you feel empowered to do blah, blah? Probably call center agents would say not so much, and software developers would say not so much, but they would say give that answer for very different reasons, right? Because the tools and the policies and the processes they interact with are radically different. So essentially you see companies focusing either on HR first and what the HR team controls, or adopting a catch fire in the business approach, which basically means having one business unit start to manage work friction, make some improvements, get some rewards on the P&L side. And as soon as you do that in one part of the business, every other business leader is going to say, right, please come hither. And
they want to know what you're doing over there.
Exactly. So, we have organizations that actually pursue both approaches simultaneously. Some pursue the HR route because they have very strong HR leadership that, where everyone marches as one. Some pursue the business route, mostly in more what I would call decentralized organization, where the business tends to be more entrepreneurial. And honestly, there's no bad way to start. Knowing that in the end, if you want to do it in full, you've got to do both.
And does it typically originate on the executive team, or is it something that you typically see HR brings to the table?
There again, very organization dependent, and I would say individual dependent. So I'm going to toot my own horn because I spent just a few years in an HR role. Most of my prior life was in business operations and business leadership roles. I find that HR executives that come from or that have an experience outside of HR tend to have very intuitive grasp of what this is and tend to want to champion it.
Okay.
So for anyone out there who is like me, not a born and bred HR professional, leverage that operations experience or that additional experience to actually buttress the pursuit of work friction within your HR organization. And we see that often is the case. So people that come from customer-facing roles, operations roles, quality, Six Sigma roles, lean, etc., even people that come from the digital world, IT, tend to go there. We see that heads of HRIT who are also well versed in all of the UX practice, right? That says product is not good until you get data that tells you that it is. Tend to run with the concept. And then there are HR executives that are actually former HR business partners tend to have been burnt by the issue in their field roles and want to fix it at group level. And also HR teams that have done human-centered design or that have actually tried the experience improvement route and found kind of challenges moving that ahead, beyond mapping some journeys and doing focus groups, which is all helpful, but want to actually move to a more systemic way of managing this. They would be the third likely HR sponsor. So it's a very disparate groups of individuals, but it's quite interesting because they tend to all. We actually run a group called the Exchange where people get together to talk about how to do this, and it's actually not a captive group; it's a nonprofit where they essentially exchange on how they figure this out, how they bring it to their company, how they build the business case, what are the different paths that they can follow. And yeah, when you see these folks interact, it's clearly a mindset thing that some have and that just carry it in their organization. So
is that for any organization? Can they join that conversation, or is that just your clients?
Yeah.
Any organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Like as long as they're committed to the cause of figuring this out.
Well, we will definitely get that information from you, and we'll put a link at the bottom so that organizations that are listening who are now fired up about this definitely want to find out more and want to be part of that. So you had talked before about if you're a HR pro and you're trying to identify whether this makes sense for your organization, you're going to look at indicators such as engagement, attrition, and then performance, of course, and make sure with performance that it's not a hill, versus a skill
Yeah.
that they are embattling.
Mm-hmm.
So for a small, let's do small, medium, and
Yep.
large organizations. For small organizations, how do they start this conversation?
Well, small organization, let's define small actually. So let's say is that
Let's say less than 1,000
less than
employees.
1,000. So from experience, beyond maybe 200 or 300 people, you start to need some data if you want to be sure about stuff.
Okay.
Uh,
So anything above 200-300. So let's go below 200-300 then.
well, yeah, so below to 300, I think what just conversations with as many conversations as possible with frontline workers that start with um, tell me what you do. So because people don't do what's in their job description, especially not in a small organization.
Yes.
So tell me what you do every day, and when you do these things, tell me what gets in your way.
What
And
gets in your way? That's the question.
that's
Okay.
right. What gets in your way that shouldn't, right? And that is one great way of defining work friction. It's what gets in my way of doing my work or doing what I'm trying to do that really shouldn't get in my way. Because there's stuff like, for example, I'm solving a customer problem and the customer is unhappy. Well, that's part of my job if I'm in customer service.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to be mad at the organization because that's my job.
Right.
However, if you don't give me the tools to do that well, or if the customer is really unhappy because something that you did as an organization, then that becomes work friction, right? So whatever gets in my way, that shouldn't. And just asking people that question and have a conversation and getting as much evidence as possible of stuff that really the organization could solve for.
And I would suspect for an organization that's 300 or less, HR could also encourage their managers to ask their people that same question.
Yes. So managers have an interesting role. And in a small company, the managers play both let's say frontline manager, but also can have an impact on the broader system, right? So what tools are being used, et cetera, et cetera. When you start getting bigger, actually managers stop having an impact on how the system is designed. So that's if we move to the medium size, which let's say would be 500 to 5,000, you see that managers, when an employee would say, so when I solve a customer problem, this gets in my way, managers just say, I know. Like I keep telling them, but nothing changes.
Oh boy.
Right. So, which is why the right kind of data has to get to people who own these processes, who own these policies, who own these tools that may sit in HR and IT and like the business leadership team, operations, etc. To say like this is not working for your workers right now. Let's go fix it. By the way, for anyone who's in the manufacturing world, for a small manufacturing organization, kind of Kaizen or Kanban lean practices of pulling up every day to say what gets in your way, that's a good enough proxy, right? The problem is to do that at scale. How do you do it now when you start to get to thousands of employees and when it's not just manufacturing?
So then you would recommend implementing some sort of data collection system, like what you have, to help you focus on the departments where you can make the most impact?
Yeah, so usually the kind of data you need should be able to answer that question at a very granular level of what gets in the way of whom and when. Right. So if you have an organization that has, let's say, salespeople and software developers and marketing people, what gets in the way of salespeople when they're trying to sell stuff to customers? When does it happen the most? So which activities are the ones where there's the most friction? And what causes it? Is it tools, processes, misalignment with other teams, whatever it is? And so the data has to tell you that. Otherwise, you get blended data that says people report that they have, they don't have everything they need to do their job.
Right.
Can't solve for that.
Yeah.
So you need, and we call that kind of data moment-centric data, because it is centered around the activities that people are trying to do. And so now you collect that data both on the day-to-day work moments, but also on HR moments to see how HR products and services are really meeting the needs of employees or not.
Can you walk us through a real life scenario situation where someone at a medium to large organization said, okay, we're going to tackle this workplace friction thing, and we're going to determine how pervasive it is in our organization, and we're going to tackle it. So can you describe to us, like, how did they come to you? What situation was it, or what were they operating under? And then maybe what was the solution and the results?
So two examples come to mind. One in a actually medium-sized organization with, I would say, let's put it this way: Glassdoor ratings below 4, and competing in a space where Glassdoor ratings should be above 4. And essentially knowing from engagement surveys that there were some issues with career mobility and some town segments that seemed to have an issue. What they did, was to come to us to say, "Can you please help us understand what is creating these gaps, right, in our engagement skyline, because we can't really tell." And what so we through very short, very targeted, and let's say low coverage surveys, we only need 50 data points to be able to identify a friction somewhere. We're able to identify two things. Number one, in career mobility, there were a set of things that were supposed to work for the company. So a career framework that was describing all the things that people could do in their career at the company, right? So, with swim lanes and all kinds of rules of going from here to here. It turns out that people could not understand that career framework because it was a beautiful HR creation that only people who'd been there for like 5 years could actually
they could decipher it
with the acronyms and so that was an example of like, here is an HR tool that is well intended, but the reality, as you said, between strategy and execution, there's a gap. And the strategy was brilliant. Like, it's like one of the best career frameworks I've ever seen, except no one understood it. So the second thing that it showed is there were newsletters going out to the organization to show all the new roles available to kind of project that sense of growth and opportunity and so on and so forth. Well, it turns out that through our data, they realized that that newsletter was going to spam for 80% of the organization. And because there was some infrastructure filter that was, turned in the wrong way, which means that no one ever saw these things. And therefore, the people's perception of availability of new roles was impaired, right? The organization was 6,000 people, so not massive, but not small either. And a few other things like this that kind of came out through the data. And the company essentially just took very basic action on these things, right? So go and flip the switch in the infrastructure to make this work. To take the career framework, sit down with a couple of employees and say, all right, how do we make this understandable? And eventually they solved this thing, and you saw the score for specific moments that have to do with career growth just jump up literally single to double, and for all these touch points to kind of increase in score single to double literally in like a month or two, right? Because that's how you fix things. You understand what's broken and you go fix it. In parallel, some of the data showed that many of the people that were on variable pay were not paid accurately. And it's not that they were never paid or whatever, but their pay slips, and there was a portal thing, never really reflected the accurate amounts because of our logging issues and all kinds of, it was a complex variable structure. But essentially, when people saw the damage that it took, where people reported, experiences as low as like 30% satisfaction with getting paid, not like, I want to be paid more, but I want to be paid accurately. And then they would call the HR team for help, and the HR team was like, well, there's not much I can do because it's done by. Yeah. So that kind of stuff actually happens on a very consistent basis in lots of organizations.
And that's a legal issue, right? I
Well,
mean, something that pervasive.
It's legal, but it's also very damaging to people's commitment to the organization, like they're for all kinds of reasons. So what they did was to essentially double down on that portal to make sure that it was very clear about, this is a temporary calculation. Here's the things that we're sure about. We're still checking data for that, and kind of made it was partly a perception issue, fixed it. And, eventually same thing, scores just went up. Overall, their Glassdoor score kind of went from like a 3.7 to a 4.2 in about 6 months through tackling these kinds of issues. So that is one example in the very HR thing. And it's actually a very small HR team operating there.
So it doesn't have to be the big, huge things that take a year. It can be sometimes the high impact that you can fix within 30 days.
Exactly. So this is there is this saying in the world of customer experience of, everyone always talks about the wow moments, right? Or the wow experiences. That needle has shifted now to saying, don't go and do wow stuff if you cannot deliver consistently good experience.
Right.
And so this notion of friction in HR products and services is about being consistently good. Right. And that you only know if you have data that actually tells you how the very complex world of HR moments and touch points is really panning out when people are interacting with it.
And in a world where quality is starting to become compromised in so many different aspects of our lives, it's now how companies can differentiate themselves.
Absolutely. So on both fronts, right? So this HR dimension and on the day-to-day work, you touched on it earlier. Like it's if you think about a competitive advantage for companies nowadays. So when you ask the question to senior business leaders, like, what's your competitive advantage moving forward? Most of them would put AI as one of them. The thing is that everyone's got it. So how is that really a differentiated advantage if in pretty much every industry, everyone is neck and neck on what they're doing with it or not doing with it? However, being able to it's almost doing an X-ray of work, right? So to understand what gets in the way of people when they do their work or when they're using enterprise services, and making that better, that's a real competitive advantage, both economically because of the productivity impact we talked about earlier, but also in terms of retaining your best talent, because best talent has a choice, right?
Absolutely. And when you think about a growth strategy, which most organizations employ today, even in tough economic times. They want to grow. Why not go after the things that are keeping you from being successful first, frees up some time, people are happier. If you want the upward trajectory for your talent, like it just makes such great sense from a strategic standpoint.
It does. So the one thing that we've learned through our data is employees, for the most part, are all trying to do their best at all times. And the question is not so much, what are you going to do to them, but more, how are you going to let them perform?
Yes.
Right. And there's this notion of, and I remember being in HR, even as a business leader, to say, let's do more training. Let's, equip them more. But actually every layer of new stuff that is done to employees, it also potentially creates friction. Whereas the question is more, what could you remove? It's a little bit the Marie Kondo of work, What could you remove from their day-to-day work or from when they interact with HR to make it easier for them to perform? Because when you make it easier, it creates a momentum that calls for more skills and also more will. That when you don't create that momentum, actually, you're expecting this individual to change a lot whilst you make it complicated for them to do what they need to do, which doesn't feel that intuitive.
And I think that's the perfect segue then to ending this part of our conversation and moving over to what we call rapid fire questions. So these are one sentence questions with one sentence answers so that our audience gets to know you a little bit better. Are you willing to play?
Yep. Let's go.
All right. Let's do this. What are bad recommendations you hear in HR that are being passed off as best practices?
Moments that matter. Because different moments matter to different people. And our data shows that every time.
What advice would you give to someone just starting out in HR?
Mind the strategy, which HR executives are typically really, really good at, but mind the delivery and know if the plan is actually coming to life and in reality by talking to employees or getting data from them.
Why should CEOs give HR the credibility they so deserve?
Half of the answer is to keep out of jail. But
that's always a good point one.
That's it's still an important one. The second one is to leverage that competitive advantage we just talked about.
So this is a great question for you. The higher you go, the more strategic acumen you need to exhibit. What is the best way for an aspiring CHRO to build their strategic acumen muscle?
Partner with business leaders. So anyone who creates real value in the organization is the ones you want to learn from and understand how that competitive advantage we talked about earlier manifests in their specific world. And then that becomes your value proposition.
If you could have your own billboard that would reach millions of people, what would the message be?
Let work flow.
It's brilliant. What are you currently reading, or what have you read recently that you could recommend to our audience?
What I would recommend is a book by Tiffany Bova that is called The Experience Mindset. And why it's very interesting is she talks a lot about the fact that the experience mindset speaks to customer experience, but also employee experience, and that the two are intimately linked. And how recently organizations have been transferring friction from customers to employees to make customers' life easier, but in turn have made employees' life harder. And that touches this friction question that we've discussed.
What is one of the best or most worthwhile investments you've ever made in your career? And it could be an investment of money, time, energy.
When I was a business leader, spending too much time complaining about the HR, actually decided to dive into what HR was doing for both recruiting and onboarding, and essentially co-create solutions with them, and spending during about three years, 80% of my time on just talent issues in partnership with HR. Made me understand the power of it because it worked. Also triggered my shift from the business to HR, which was a super valuable change in perspective for me.
What's a tangible next step that our listeners can take back to their business?
Have a conversation with CEO and business leaders about work friction. They're all very concerned about it. They will all say, "Oh, it's become too complicated to do work here. We're so bureaucratic. We're blah, blah, blah." What they're saying is there's too much work friction, and they don't know how to tackle it. HR can play a role in being a champion of it and actually orchestrating an approach across the organization to tackle it, if they so choose. And that's a pretty powerful mission statement for a progressive HR executive.
Incredibly powerful. Where can people go to learn more about you?
About me on LinkedIn, Christophe Martel. So that's Christophe, CHRISTOPHE Martel. And at getfount.com, which is the website for our company.
Today, we have been joined by Christophe Martel, co-founder and CEO of Fount. Thank you again for joining me, Christophe. It has been such a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Berta. I appreciate the questions and appreciate the time, and thanks to your audience.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks so much for watching. We would love it if you shared your thoughts on any of the topics we discussed in the comments below. And if you got value from the video, it would mean the world to us if you hit the like button and subscribe to the HRMorning channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Voices of HR.